Hello and welcome to or welcome back to Colonial Outcasts, the anti-imperialist podcast that has released way too many episodes this week. Sorry, don't want to go the way of Star Trek in the 90s, release too much stuff and give y'all franchise fatigue. But I've just been getting too many questions about what the International Criminal Court arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant actually means. First, I'm just going to need some of y'all to actually stop doing something for those reducing the arrest warrants to meaningless publicity. It has enormous potential to stifle and prevent other political leaders, individuals, and companies from eventually halting their support of sending weapons and money to Israel, lest they face possible charges after the fact. Because power resides where people believe it resides. Yes, there's no enforcement mechanism for the ICC. We're going to talk about that. But we're waging an information war, and this is an important step in pushing this violent apartheid state into pariah statehood, like the way have it go the way of South Africa. So let's approach this and discuss it properly. I just wanted to do a kind of a call to action to start, like, even if a lot of people are feeling hopeless right now, just keep holding the line with this. All right. So we are going to be talking about all this with Kristen, an Australian and Italian international human rights lawyer. She's been active in advocacy for Palestinian human rights for nearly 10 years since a life-changing trip to the West Bank. This is the third time we've talked about this ICC case. I know it's way after midnight in Aussie land. Thanks so much for staying up so we can beat the other programs to publication with an analytical deep dive. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Anything for you, Greg.
Thanks. Okay, so first of all, let's start with the basics. I think Mark is able to join us, co-host of this little endeavor. He's just coming into studio now. We're just like really flying by the seat of our pantsuit here, but let's look at some Sky News reporting real quick before we get into it.
Ali, great to have you with us. First, has there been any reaction to this so far in Israel?
There hasn't been any reaction officially from Netanyahu's office. I have texted officials close to the Israeli Prime Minister, but there's been no reaction yet. But we know, or we can predict, how they will react, given that when the chief prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, who's a British lawyer, first sought these arrest warrants, it was met with a lot of anger and, frankly, disbelief by senior members of the Israeli government and a lot of people in Israel as well. They were disgusted at the idea that the ICC could be investigating Israeli leaders for war crimes when it was Hamas that carried out the October the 7th attacks. But the initial request by the chief prosecutor of the ICC included, as well as Netanyahu and the former now Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, it included the two Hamas leaders, Yahya Sinwar and Ismail Haniyeh. Well, they're now both dead, killed by Israel, so they're no longer on the charge sheet, as it were. And Mohammed Daif, another senior member, commander of Hamas, an arrest warrant has been issued for him as well. Israel says that they had killed him, but Hamas have not confirmed it officially. So effectively 3 arrest warrants have been issued by the International Criminal Court, but the 2 most significant, for obvious reasons, are those against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. The court, in their statement they released, said that they have reasonable grounds to believe that those 2 men have been carrying out the war crime of starvation as a method of warfare and the crimes against humanity of murder, persecution and other inhumane acts. Now, it's been quite a lengthy process to get to this point ever since the arrest warrants were first sought about 6 or 7 months ago.
All right, yeah, and let's keep something in mind. Like when the ICC recommended arrest warrant for Putin at the onset of the war in Ukraine, happened surprisingly quickly, and I do think there is a lot of shock within the Israeli government right now, charging Western leaders or like Western allies with ICC warrants, which is an institution meant to power project and control other parts of the world outside of the West, actually got hit with these warrants. And Karim Khan, a few months ago, said a Western official on an interview, I think it was on the BBC, but I'd have to verify that, said he was approached by a senior Western official that said what are you doing, essentially? The ICC is meant for African warlords and thugs like Putin. Obviously, there's a lot of immense political pressure behind the scenes to make this ICC arrest warrant never happen. You had a bunch of GOP Republican U.S. senators sign a letter saying that they were going to sanction these justices and the families of these justices who were reviewing the ICC warrants, make sure they never got like U.S. visas, stuff like that. It's just been pretty insane. So I kind of wanted to start with what do you make of this? And in broad terms, why is this actually significant?
Yeah. Well, you're right, Greg, in that when this was announced versus when Putin's arrest warrant was announced. In Putin's case, they actually only took 23 days to issue the arrest warrant for Putin, just for some comparison. Whereas in this case, as of today, it was 185 days. So it's about 26 weeks or half a year. So there was a huge delay. And if folks are hoping that there's going to be an explanation for the court why there was a delay, no such luck. But it is really significant that the court has issued these arrest warrants, and that's for a number of reasons. The first reason is that, as you mentioned before, this is not the kind of people that the court was really, I think, when it was established, necessarily envisaged prosecuting. As you say, as a senior US official said, that it was mostly for African warlords and for thugs like Putin, right? So for a while in international circles, it's been called the African Criminal Court because they're just prosecuting African warlords. It was never really seen as, I don't think, was really seen as a mechanism to hold Western leaders accountable until, I think, very recent times. And what's interesting here is that even issuing an arrest warrant for a sitting head of state is actually extremely rare. And that's because of a thing called head of state immunity, that effectively a person has immunity for certain official acts that they do in office. Now, there's sort of a workaround in that if they commit crimes against humanity or war crimes, those fall outside their official duties. But even still, it's as a political achievement as well, not just a legal one, to be issuing a warrant for a sitting head of state is huge. Obviously, with Putin, they did it with Putin, Gaddafi, but he was killed before he was brought before the court, and Charles Taylor. So this is not a very long list of heads of state who have had an arrest warrant issued against them. The second thing that I would say that's really fascinating and monumental about this case is that it represents, probably, as far as I'm aware, it's the first time that a Western leader has been charged with using starvation as a weapon of war. And that's really significant because that's actually a relatively recent crime under international law. So for most of the history of modern international law, starvation was not actually a crime. Starvation as a weapon of war was not actually a crime. That was for a few reasons. One of the reasons was that it was seen as sort of the final frontier, to use your Star Trek reference, the final frontier before you get into full-scale war. So it was still seen as sort of like an economic kind of policy, and it was preferable to all-out war. But also it was used effectively to keep order in the colonies. It was a favoured tool of the British and of the US. Every major power used starvation as a weapon of war during World War II. The US used it in the Pacific. The Nazis tried to starve out the Russians. There was the talk about getting rid of 100 million useless mouths. So it's been a very recent development that this has been prosecuted as a war crime. And I think this is probably the first time that it has been used against a Western leader.
Yeah, and you know, it's starvation as a weapon of war is like a basic ancient premise of siege warfare in itself. That and disease, and it's almost like what's happening in Gaza is inherently medieval. So yeah, and then starvation as a weapon to keep order or subdue resistance in the colonies was always been a thing. I think we were talking about this right before the show. My favorite Winston Churchill quote is, during the Bengal famine where millions died during World War II because they rerouted all the agricultural products from Bengal to the Western Front. When he heard about the starvation and the famine in Bengal, Winston Churchill said, "Famine in Bengal, then why isn't Gandhi dead yet?" And that's the side of Winston Churchill that a lot of people don't like to talk about. But yes, so starvation as a weapon of war, it's since the beginning, I've basically Mark's still trying to figure out his camera. Since the beginning, I've been saying, like, you don't have enough bullets and you don't have enough bombs to kill everybody in Gaza. It just doesn't exist. Plus, there's psychological impacts, ramifications. We saw that with the SS foreign brigades in Poland during the First World War. They had to stop doing it because they started shooting their officers. They started killing themselves, drinking themselves to death. Discipline completely broke down. So you have to create a degree of separation. The easiest way to do that, and if you want to wipe everybody out, is starvation. The frontiersmen in the American West, you can see these massive photos of mountains of buffalo bones to starve out the indigenous Americans. You just need you need one degree of separation from actually doing it. And so this is why, for me, if you study any of the genocides in history, starvation is a prerequisite and exists in all of them.
Well, yes, exactly. It's very genocidal is what I was going to say. And what's really interesting about this arrest warrant, so and just to sort of refresh, in the original arrest warrant application, the prosecutor, Karim Khan, he didn't actually charge genocide. And that was an option that is available to him. That's in the ICC statute. You can charge genocide. But he didn't. He charged crimes against humanity and war crimes. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that even the Nazis were not charged with genocide because it didn't exist as an international crime yet. They were charged as crimes against humanity. Interestingly, the Nazis were actually acquitted of using starvation as a weapon. It wasn't a crime at that time, but it sort of fell into some more general crimes against humanity. But they're actually acquitted on that particular tactic because, as I said, it wasn't really seen as terribly bad until about the 70s. But what's interesting in this, what they've done in this decision, even though the prosecutor has not gone for genocide, he has gone for extermination. And effectively, extermination is kind of analogous to genocide. Genocide is different in the sense that you need a specific intent to eliminate a group, part or all of a group based on ethnic or national or religious characteristics, whereas crimes against humanity, you have to show that it's part of a widespread and systematic attack or a plan. But they're effectively more or less the same. And I think there's some hidden language in here, some sort of, if you read between the lines in the decision, the ICC pretrial chamber have sort of said, we think that the crime of extermination, based on the evidence we've been given by the prosecutor, is not made out. But the crime of murder as a crime against humanity is made out. And the only difference between extermination, which is our proxy for genocide here, and the crime against humanity of murder is the scale of the killing. So that really suggests that the court is almost hinting, I suppose, that not enough evidence has been put forward by the prosecutor that these attacks are happening on a large scale, which might sound ridiculous to anyone who's seen what's been happening in Gaza. But like you said, when there's this 1 degree of separation, when it's inflicting conditions of life that are going to bring about the destruction of the group because of starvation, you've really got to show that, first of all, that's intentional and that it is targeted at Gazans as a group, not just as the individual consequences of those policies.
Kristen, I've been hearing this talking point brought up by, say, Israelis defending it, and I've always wanted to know what would be the smoking gun that would officially make it a genocide under legal terminology with the ICC, because they'll just say, well, it's not intentional because you have to have that particular element of showing intention that you're trying to get rid of a group. But given the rhetoric that comes from Israeli officials, and media personalities, it all amounts to language of intention for a genocide, even invoking like, biblical terminology, like, getting rid of the seed of Amalek. So what would make it officially a genocide? Would Benjamin Netanyahu have to come out and say, hey guys, I'm trying to commit a genocide here? I just don't understand.
Yeah, and that's a lot of, I think, purposeful misdirection, because in my opinion, this is clearly a genocide. And the UN Special Committee on the, I think, the right of the Palestinian territories last week came out and said that basically what's happening in Gaza is consistent with the characteristics of a genocide.
Yeah,
And
I read about that.
Yeah, consistent with the characteristics of the genocide is basically lawyer talk for it meets all the elements, but because the ICJ has to actually officially decide, we don't want to say anything that prejudices their decision because the case is still ongoing. But it is a genocide. And what makes a genocide, when we're looking at these statements, you actually don't have to articulate. There has never been a requirement that you have to actually say, hey, I want to do a genocide. The crime itself, its historical development, basically acknowledges that no one usually is that stupid enough to go out and say, hey, I'm going to do a genocide. I intend to kill this ethnic group in whole or in part, or intend to do things that bring about the destruction. In the history of genocide, no one has done that. So this idea that he would have to go out and say that he's doing a genocide is ridiculous. It's like saying that you can't convict someone of murder unless you have a confession. People get convicted of murder all the time without a confession because you're looking at the circumstances, and the circumstances suggest their intent. So if this person, is going to see someone else and they pack a handgun with them and they say, I'm really going to get him, you can imply from that he had intent. And the same thing with genocide. It has never been required that Netanyahu would need to go out there and say, I'm doing a genocide. But he basically has said that already. And,
He has.
He has.
I would say that the language that the Israeli officials use is even more blatant than in historical circumstances.
100%. I think.
Yeah, because and I just want to bring this up for the audience that they're like all genocides. Basically, because human nature and human beings don't vary all that much, there are like 10 really common stages of genocide. This is according to like the Holocaust Memorial. So like stage 1, you have classification, them, us, the Arabs, the Palestinians, boom, separating them. And then first ideologically and then physically. So apartheid, Jim Crow South, stuff like that. Then symbolization, a visual manifestation of hatred. Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe were first aware of the Yellow Star of David. Palestinian symbolization has like different license plates, different colored ID cards, stuff like that. And now they say like the watermelon is a genocidal symbol. Then discrimination, obviously. Dehumanization is stage 4. So a great example of that is Gaza, when foreign ministers say that Gaza is a pit of snakes, or Yoav Gallant, who's actually charged, says that Palestinians are human animals. Then organizations, they've been planning for this for a long time. Polarization, propaganda begins to spread hate by hate groups. The Nazis used newspapers, Der Stürmer, to spread incite messages. Now they do it on social media. They do it on X. They have paid accounts that do it instead of having like a centralized newspaper, although they do have newspapers that are straight up like genocidal in their language. And then preparation, persecution, extermination, and then denial. And of course, denial, all of these stages, it doesn't go from one to another. These are all stages happening at one time, but this is generally the trajectory. And Israel's been denying this since the beginning. And of course, denial exists from stage 1 to stage 10. And I just wanted to show that because, it is really consistent. Everything that's happened is really consistent with, past genocides and the criteria.
Yeah, and that bouncing off that, Greg, let's also remember that I want to be clear that also there is a difference between the specific intent requirement that's needed to prove genocide and the crime of incitement to genocide. So a lot of these statements that are being made, even if there isn't a genocide that's actually established, you can still look at the crime of incitement to genocide. And incitement to genocide is also a crime that exists in international law and also under domestic law, and almost always accompanies a genocide. So, like, relating to some of the things that you mentioned, you know, a way of demonstrating intent without actually saying necessarily, I want to do a genocide. One of the ways that has been established is like a prediction. So if you make a prediction, like, for example, the Defense Minister saying that we need to flatten entire neighborhoods in Gaza, flatten all of Gaza. There should be no electricity, no gasoline, moving vehicles, nothing. That qualifies as incitement. Or, you know, dehumanization. When you mentioned, you know, we're dealing with human animals, that's also, I think, a clear statement of intent. Euphemism is another thing, because the case law recognizes that people don't just come out and say, I'm going to do a genocide. And you mentioned this before, I think, Greg, that you must remember what the Amalek has done to you, says, you know, our Holy Bible, which was from Netanyahu. That sort of euphemism and metaphor, that counts for the purposes of establishing, I think what Mark mentioned, establishing that they have intent. So it's never been required that you actually have to go out there and say that. And as you showed from the different stages, it is a process of sort of subterfuge of creating symbols and messaging so that your audience knows what you're talking about, but you still have plausible deniability.
Also, one thing that I did want to bring up that's also under the logical fallacy called accusation in a mirror. It's a part of incitement hate speech. It's basically, you know, when people say it's called like mirror politics. It's when people say every Israeli accusation is a confession. Well, accusation in a mirror is basically a false claim that accuses the target of doing something that the perpetrator is doing or intends to do. We saw this during the Rwandan genocide. Basically, you know, it's drawing on ideals from like Joseph Goebbels when he instructed colleagues to, quote, impute to enemies exactly what they and their own party are planning to do. So when you know, propagandists, Israeli propagandists say from the river to the sea is genocidal, they want to cleanse all Israelis from this land. That is a great example of accusation in a mirror, especially since the Likud party came up with the term in the first place. So this is another part of incitement speech too. It's dehumanization, mirror politics, a whole bunch of stuff.
So it's said that, you know, where dehumanization makes genocide seem normal, accusations in a mirror make it seem necessary.
Yes.
So the dehumanization is like, oh yeah, it's totally normal to kill these people. And then the accusations in a mirror sort of creates that impetus for action. Accuse them of what you're about to do because you can't deny it.
Yeah. And so in one of the basic ways when I try to explain like genocide and how, you know, when looking at the scale of what happened in the Congo or what happened in Europe with Jewish people and the Roma and Slavs and concentration camps and stuff, there's this scale that I think because people only know about that one, because it was a Western, it happened in Europe. They only know about that one thing. And so they're like, there isn't enough numbers. Only 40,000 have been killed. Well, far more than that. That's just when they were able to stop counting. But it's not based off of numbers because the dimensions of every conflict are different. It's based off of intent, what your leaders are saying, and does that affect the conduct of troops on the ground and policies made in the legislature?
Yeah, exactly. And you know, that's a really important point that it's not a numbers game. One of the most horrific justifications or explanations I see coming out of the Hasbara for like why it's not a genocide is this, you know, this idea of that the Gaza has a positive birth rate, that they're not killing people fast enough for it to be a genocide. I don't know if you've seen people make that sort of point. But the point that you make is right. It's not a numbers game. So if you look at the crime of extermination, for example, which is analogous with genocide, that could be used for thousands of people, but it's also been applied to cases where of like 60 people being killed because the intent is destruction on a large scale, right? So that's the intent requirement, that you intend large scale destruction. Large scale is not about numbers. Large scale is about, do I intend to destroy this this group. Like, who am I targeting and why am I targeting them? Am I targeting them for their membership of a group? And are they being killed because of their membership of this collective? And that's what is meant by this kind of large scale requirement. It's not, oh, it has to be thousands. No, it depends on the circumstances of the case, the size of the group, the area in which it's happening, the amount of time, and over the space that it's happening in. As I said, killing 60 people could be a large scale killing. Killing thousands could be as well. It's not about the numbers.
Which is why, like, instances like Black Wall Street in Oklahoma, that would have been considered a genocide because it was targeting. There's people looking back on that in retrospect and saying that that was a genocide because it was targeting of Black people who had a town, and it was directly implied that they were targeting them because they're Black and they were successful. So they wanted to destroy not only them physically, but also just their livelihood. And the town was raised, but we don't look back at that calling it a genocide for whatever reason. So I think, like, maybe this is now we can change that part of history so that we can future states can no longer get away with this, which is probably why this ICC ruling is very good, because at least it sets an historical precedent for the future, right? So
yeah, I mean, I did want to get into, now that we've kind of contextualized it and why they used the language that they did and why they made the ruling that they did. Everyone's wondering in my comment section, what is this actually going to accomplish? Because we have to acknowledge that the ICC doesn't have its own private little military with extraction squads to pick up Netanyahu in Israel, and there's no enforcement mechanism. So I'm getting a lot of comments like, yeah, like them and what army, stuff like that. And the Rome Statute, it was founded by the Rome Statute, is a treaty that established the ICC. It was adopted at a diplomatic conference in Rome in 1998 and entered into force in 2002. As of this year, 125 states are party to the statute. And among other things, it establishes court function, jurisdiction, and like structure. So it's meant to apply to individuals, not states, which is the ICJ. But we're not going to talk about the ICJ in this one. So basically, if you guys are just coming into the subject matter, if you have an arrest warrant from the ICC and you go to a country that's part of the ICC, they are bound by treaty to arrest you and, send you where you're supposed to go.
And Greg, can you talk about the ASPA, the American Service Members Protection Act, that George Bush signed into, that actually provides some type of element where we could actually invade the Hague in case they arrest American service members?
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't do that. Well, I mean, Kristen's already talked about that on a previous episode, but yes. So, however, the reason, and Israel's not a signatory of the Rome Statute, so technically, they argue that they cannot be held accountable by the ICC. However, Palestine, the Palestinian territories, are a member of the ICC, and the genocide that's being committed is being committed on Palestinian territory, making those leaders subject to it. Is that a correct reading?
Yeah, that's right. And what's interesting is that in this arrest warrant decision, they actually noted Israel's objection to the jurisdiction and said, basically, in not so many words, it doesn't matter. We don't need your consent to have jurisdiction because Palestine is a state party, and that's where the acts are happening. So too bad, so sad.
So if there's no enforcement mechanism, I think some people don't understand why this is important.
Yeah.
Why this is a big deal.
Okay, so this is a point that I want to make, because we've talked about the ICJ and the ICC like a few times now. You and I, Greg, and the same kind of questions come up about like, oh, there's no enforcement mechanism, and like they don't have an army. And I would just say this, first of all, we're talking about international law, not supranational law. And I think this question tends to come a lot of the time from folks in the USA. I think because the USA has sort of set itself up as being a sort of supranational force, that, the world police, that sort of kind of imagery, and that's the role that they have in the world, even though we know that they're for other self-interested reasons. But this kind of idea that if there's a wayward state, the US can go and invade them and they'll do that, right? That's not international law. That's a supranational function. So if we want a body that has enforcement powers and has its own military, what you want there is a supranational body. But no one, the basic premise is that that's not a good idea, because if you create a supranational body that does that, you basically just have like the United States or Russia. You just have a superpower effectively running things. So the idea of an international system as opposed to a supranational system is that this body doesn't have its own existence beyond the community of states. It's supposed to be cooperative. So we can talk about, oh yeah, but there's no enforcement, no, they don't have a military. It's like, well, yeah, but we would have to create an entirely different system that would have very serious repercussions if it did have those kind of powers. You know, the kind of people that talk about not wanting the US to have the military influence that it does in the world, will then on the other hand talk about, oh, well, the ICC has no teeth and, you know, there's no, well, if you don't want a supranational power running the world, your alternatives have to just be cooperation. And that's what you have from an international law system. So the best that you can get from an international law system is cooperation. Now, what's different about the ICC as opposed to perhaps membership of the UN and Security Council and General Assembly is that states had to sign up to the ICC, right? So they had to actually sign up and ratify the ICC. So generally speaking, states don't then go back and say, oh no, we're not going to do it, because it was a voluntary commitment in the first place. And you remember that when we talked about this early on, I said that I think this will be a game changer, because there is no way that Europe will not enforce these. And that is, well, one, because they have a tradition of, you know, a human rights court, but more so because Europe actually have, you know, cooperative mechanisms that basically keeps the European Union going. And if any, you know, European Union state is like, well, we don't want to uphold this decision of the ICC, then they're going to start looking at each other like, well, are you going to uphold the decisions of the EU? And what about our court? So that's why I think you saw a lot of European countries coming out even before these arrest warrants were issued. I think France came out and said that they have every intention of upholding it. So did I think the Prime Minister of Holland came out and said that. And you'll recall that just over a week ago, the Prime Minister of Holland was denouncing anti-Semitism in the form of attacks against soccer hooligans. So I think this is a game changer. This gives sort of the writ to countries, including all of those in the European Union, to say they have to enforce it. And not only do they have to enforce it, they're choosing to. So the other thing to bear in mind is that a lot of countries, Australia is one of them, so is the US and European countries, they have sanctions regimes that can be triggered when there is a decision from an international body like the ICC to issue an arrest warrant. So their own domestic systems require some sort of decision by an international body that they can then use to put those processes into effect. So I think you're also going to be seeing that now that there is an arrest warrant out for Netanyahu and Gallant, they're going to be placed on sanctions lists.
Yeah. And so people will be like, okay, so they can't go on vacation to the French Riviera. So what? It's not going to stop them. It's not going to stop anything. And of course, I have my own answer. That's just the challenge that they would give back.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that this is more than just the French Riviera.
Yeah.
I would say that basically the whole world, aside from the United States, is now unsafe for Netanyahu and Gallant. And I don't think that Israel counts as a place that's safe for them either, because bear in mind, Mr. Netanyahu is not having a pretty rough go of it right now, because his team tried to get his bribery trial adjourned, delayed because of the war that he keeps waging. And they basically said, no, we're going to go ahead with it. Now, you might recall that the star witness in that case is Arnon Milchan, who was a co-accused, and then he turned and he's giving evidence against Netanyahu. The case pretty much looks like a slam dunk. If he loses that case, he loses office. So not only would he have a live arrest warrant against him, he also wouldn't have the protection of his official status. The only place, I think it is pretty uncontroversial said the only place in the world that Netanyahu could really be safe right now is the United States. And that also includes layovers and stopping for refueling anywhere. So he's basically stuck in a little cage.
Well, I heard that that's why he couldn't have as many people on his airplane, because it would have taken up too much fuel. So he had to lighten the airplane load. But another question I had was also financial assets. For example, he can't park his assets in Europe, correct? So they could do investigations and track down, like if he has a Swiss bank account. I don't know if that's already, I mean, I'm assuming he does have European financial assets in certain tax havens that they're targeting now.
Yeah, I think absolutely would. And I think for someone like Netanyahu, I know that, in the US that there's kind of quite a US-centric view of if people could come to the United States, why would they go anywhere else? But for people like Netanyahu, you've got to bear in mind also, they're very Tel Aviv is 4 hours from Europe. These people have their lives intertwined with European institutions. The European Union is a huge economic and financial power, and so being sanctioned by the EU is going to be terrifying for someone like Netanyahu. Like you said, he's probably got his assets all offshore. And that counts. And the thing is, the cooperation provisions in the court, this is not just one provision in the Rome Statute that says, please cooperate with the court. There's a whole section on it, on all of the different types of international legal cooperation, all of the various things, the requests. We can't know for sure because the requests for assistance are confidential. But yeah, like you said, they could be asking for that kind of stuff as well in connection with his arrest.
Yeah, but I did find a workaround if he wants to park his money in Europe. He can't do it anywhere except Belarus. And check this out. See that little red dot right there on the Italian peninsula?
Was it the Vatican?
That's the Papal States, baby. Just park that in the Vatican Bank. They've taken worse money.
Yeah, wow. Interestingly, the Pope has actually come out and said that he wants an inquiry into whether there's genocide happening. So maybe he's not going to be so welcome at St. Peter's after all.
Yeah, well, okay. So basically what we're getting to is, there's no enforcement mechanism, but it's normalizing this idea that Israel and its leaders are criminal. Its policy is criminal, and that's just another brick on the long path, the many, many years path to complete pariah statehood, which is has economic and lifestyle consequences that eventually brought down South African apartheid.
Well, as far as pariah statehood goes, I think this is a huge step in the direction of pariah statehood, because I mean, what else brings you pariah statehood than not being able to go to any country, essentially like any country in the world that is a party to the Rome Statute? It has 125 state parties. Mm-hmm. He's really trapped here. I really can't stress enough how this has isolated Netanyahu and Gallant. And Mr. Gallant, who was fired by Netanyahu, is still on the hook for war crimes. So, that it's a huge step in that direction. And I think that people are going to be surprised because the way that states act about commitments that they voluntarily signed up to, as opposed to ones that are enforced on them, I think is going to surprise people, because I cannot think of a single state that is a current party to the Rome Statute that would dare defy the orders of the court. And I think we're going to see it's going to have an impact, definitely, even if it can't be enforced. It's going to have an impact in sort of how Netanyahu has to conduct his affairs, how Israel interacts with the rest of the world, and how leaders of countries that don't particularly want to arrest Netanyahu are going to sort of get around that. So I think that it's definitely going to shape things going forward. It's just a question of how. And let's not forget also, by the way, that the fact that he's in Israel doesn't necessarily mean that he might end up in another country. I mentioned on the first time I spoke with you, Greg, the Eichmann case, which was effectively an arrest warrant out for
extraordinary rendition.
Yeah, and that was some extraordinary rendition, or that I think it was in The Dark Knight, where they kidnapped that banker from Hong Kong and then just drop him back in the US for prosecution. So, I mean, if this were Mossad that were tasked with this, they would find a way of putting him somewhere. So it'll be interesting to see that too. He's effectively got a bounty on his head.
Right. And for the sake of fairness, when certain countries will enforce the ICC rulings more so than others. Okay, so let's just look at this map one more time. BRICS conference from a couple years ago was in South Africa, and Putin couldn't go because the South African government told him, if you come here, we're going to have to arrest you. However, if you look at this map here, he in September, so Mongolia right there, green country, a signatory, he went to Mongolia, and of course, nothing happened to him. But then again, what is Mongolia going to do? Like, look at that geostrategic position and look at Russia. So, but when it comes to the Western Europe, I think they're much more invested for their own political reasons in adhering to the Rome Statute than Mongolia is on the border of Russia.
Well, Kristen, what would be the repercussions if a signatory state did not enforce it? Is there any repercussions that are in place as a contingent for that, or no?
Not really, but I suspect that what would effectively happen is that they would be expelled from the they have the option of being being expelled from the Rome Statute. But there isn't really like a serious consequence, like we said before, like no enforcement if they don't decide to uphold it. But also bear in mind that the crimes that he's charged with, they're universal in jurisdiction. So like anyone can arrest him at any place.
Well, I was going to say, is it a possible scenario where an average citizen could just do a citizen's arrest and try to, because I was thinking like what also this does, it kind of psychologically emboldens Europeans. So whatever we saw in Amsterdam could be like, well, hey guys, like this is like the new thing now. We got backing from the ICC. I just see a whole psychological emboldening of Europeans who are like, dude, we're doing the legal work of God here under the ICC, so we can just start whooping Israeli ass and feel justified by it. But I was just thinking, so if Bibi Netanyahu was walking down the streets of like Paris and somebody recognized him, technically a citizen could just grab him and shove him in a van and then drive him all the way up to the Hague, or no? I'm just thinking.
Yeah, I mean, technically speaking, anyone can at any time.
Wow,
most countries do have some kind of like requirement that you have to bring them before like a court, and then the Attorney General gets a sign off or something like that. But yeah, in theory, it's, again, imagine how terrifying that is. Like a crime with universal jurisdiction, any country can take action against you at any time, regardless of where you are in the world. That's got to be making him nervous. Like, I don't care what anyone says, that the fact knowing that anyone can arrest you for this crime at any place at any time has got to make you, even in Israel, like he's not the most popular man there either. So he's really got a target on his head there. Of course, other Western leaders are going to be watching with interest because he's, as I said, the first Western leader to go before the court and to be tried for crimes that, to be honest, a lot of other Western leaders have also committed. So
I remember in 2011, one of Dick Cheney's aides said he was concerned about being charged. It never happened, but he was still concerned. But now it's actually happened, and now there's a precedent for it.
They should be concerned, and that is absolutely why the US is basically going like ham for Israel. In my opinion, it's not about Israel. They can't concede at all in the ICC thing because Israel is almost a proxy for trying US presidents. And let's be honest, every single living US president should probably be before the ICC. So they're going to go for broke when it comes to doing everything in their power to obstruct Netanyahu from. That's why I say that the US is the only safe place, is because there's no way that the US can hand over Netanyahu. They wouldn't anyway. They haven't ratified, but without also entangling their entire leadership. And let's not forget that the ICC is also looking into US war crimes.
Does the legalities also expand to accomplices? Like, does it are there provisions where you can go after people who aid and abet
Yeah.
Netanyahu? So that's also another thing, because let's say Netanyahu is trying to evade arrest in Europe or something, and somebody's helping him out. Does that create legal provisions for arrest of people who in his sphere, not just him, but also in his sphere of influence?
There's some really, under the statute, there's different ways of committing these kind of offences. So you can commit them, in concert with people, or sort of, like you said, like an aiding and abetting. And yeah, if the court found that basically there was someone who was obstructing the court, they could be charged in concert with them.
So, yeah, the precedent is important, and I think some people still listening will be like, "Yeah, well, I still don't really get how this changes anything." Well, it's just one brick in the road down. And again, this is significant. It's a precedent. And I would caution people when they were trying to educate people in their own personal sphere about this, to kind of play up the fact that this is significant. This is an information war, and we're trying to, leverage people's belief in these international systems. And again, Europeans actually are more concerned about international law than Americans are. We don't have any countries that we have to get along with. We have Canada and Mexico. Okay, great. But the whole European order is kind of held in place after very violent history by these international systems, and they don't. There's definitely some nervousness about throwing it all out the window as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's not underestimate also, as I mentioned before, the power of sanctions, because if you recall, the Trump administration, last time he was in power, they actually sanctioned the ICC prosecutor because how dare she try and hold Netanyahu and US people responsible. And basically the way that those sanctions worked is that not only could she not go to the United States, but she couldn't trade with any US business, which means couldn't put her money in a US bank, couldn't order something off Amazon if she wanted to. So bear in mind that these kind of sanctions, they have humongous repercussions in terms of what they affect in someone's daily life, particularly someone like Netanyahu, who is, I assume, has a very diversified portfolio, to put it that way.
And also he spent his whole life acting with impunity.
Exactly. And we know that when people spend their entire lives acting with impunity, they do stupid shit because they never expect to get caught, right? So
reminds me of Eric Adams and his Istanbul trips. But sorry, if you don't live in the New York America, Eric Adams is a cartoonishly corrupt governor of New York City. So anyways, I think he'll be the next Democratic candidate for president with the way the DNC is going. But anyways, y'all, I just keep in mind, this is, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record. This is all part of Israeli isolation, which will end the genocide and end apartheid. This slow process. It's going to take years, but this is an important development. And I think y'all should consider it as such, even if you don't really yet understand the full implications of this. So I've got to go. I've got another interview in an hour. Again, guys, sorry. I hope you guys don't get franchise fatigue from all the episodes we're doing. But I just want to say thank you, Kristen, so much for coming on and talking about the ICC warrants. A pleasure as always, and thanks for staying up so late.
Oh, my pleasure. I love the chat. It's nice to talk to people who care about these things. I myself popped some champagne when I found out the news, so if that gives an idea of how momentous that I think it is, so I hope it does, because I said to you, I think early on in one of the first episodes, Greg, that this is sort of the Empire Strikes Back. This is the sort of if nothing else, it is exciting to see these mechanisms that were created to privilege Western democracies in the international order be used against them. And I think that's exciting. And I think to say that this means nothing really undermines and devalues the work of people from the Global South who have worked so hard for years to campaign to get this sort of momentum and accountability happening. So I, for one, think that is reason enough to acknowledge that this is a monumentous step towards accountability and ending impunity.
Well, plus the defeat it does to the Mossad, which used all types of intimidation tactics against the ICC, the threatening of their family members, the weird back alley mafia style approaches with the envelope full of money. Like it kind of like is saying, well, all that espionage was for nothing because it went through. So
yeah, wasted a couple billion there. So yeah, exactly right. Exactly. And as I said also to Greg on one of the earlier episodes, even if you don't understand why this is important, look at what the Mossad are doing. Why would they be doing this? Why would they be going so hard to dissuade this investigation if it didn't matter? They wouldn't, because there would be no justification for it. So if for no other reason, at least think they're scared. Because the thing that Israel needs in order to keep doing what it's doing, it needs to be able to trade on the fact that it's the only democracy in the Middle East and it adheres to the international rules-based order. If it doesn't have that, it's Iran, and it can't be Iran in the where it's placed itself in the world order. So taking away this semblance of legality and saying, actually, no, your state is run by a war criminal, I think that's huge.
Yeah. And again, people writing about the collapse of South Africa even 5 years before couldn't even imagine it happening. So there's hope springs eternal, and today is a good day in the long fight against colonialism and imperialism. So, all right, I have to go for reals, y'all. Thank you so much for coming on, and we will see you.
Anytime.
Yeah, anytime, and we'll see y'all in the next one, which is going to be coming later today. Sorry. Bye.
Live long and prosper. Bye.